The American Civil War, by almost any measure, is the deadliest war the United States has ever fought. In fact, it is so far and away the worst by death toll that more soldiers were lost during it than World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined. And yet, despite the scale of the destruction, only 3 men were ever brought up on charges for atrocities committed during the entire conflict. As you might imagine, you'd have to be a special kind of evil to end up on that list. So in this video, we're going to go over one of these men and what he did to end up there. As always, viewer discretion is advised. By the fall of 1864, so 3 years in by this point, the American Civil War had reached a point where every strategic resource mattered. As a result, Saltville, Virginia became an essential target for the Union, or the North, because the Confederacy, or the South, depended on salt production and distribution. Salt-preserved meat kept supply lines functional, and without it, soldiers went hungry fast. And Saltville, as you might have guessed by the name, produced it in abundance, which made it a critical piece of Southern infrastructure and a target that the Union wanted badly. The Union marched toward the town in early October with the objective to damage or destroy the salt works and disrupt Confederate resources, but the Confederates weren't about to let that just happen. What followed was a brutal, muddy fight in rough terrain with heavy losses on both sides. And when the shooting finally stopped, the Union had failed to take the town. Union troops then withdrew in defeat, leaving behind dozens of wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved in time. Among these soldiers were members of the 5th United States Colored Cavalry, who were one of the few black regiments who had been formed recently and entered the service. The men of the 5th fought hard and suffered badly, and afterward, many of them were lying defenselessly exactly where they had dropped in battle. For all intents and purposes, the battle should have been over, but the killing somehow wasn't. What came next defied the rules of war in a particularly gruesome way. Soon after, there was a hunt for wounded men who had no way to fight back. Over the next few hours, armed Confederate irregulars, which may be better known as guerrilla fighters, moved through the battlefield, finishing off the injured Union soldiers. Soldiers were shot where they fell or dragged out of hiding spots and killed, and the number of dead from these executions eventually reached into the dozens. Then after that was completed, they traveled several miles to one of the sites used to house wounded Union soldiers, which was a makeshift hospital at Emory and Henry College. Now, even in the war's darkest days, hospitals were meant to be off-limits, but for a man named Champ Ferguson, this didn't matter. He walked into the hospital with a rifle and moved from room to room, identifying targets before leaving a wake of bodies behind him. To him, wounded men were simply easier to kill. One of the men in these beds was Lieutenant Elza Smith, and he was so badly injured during the Battle of Saltville that he was unable to move. Champ then stepped up to his bedside and lifted his weapon, placing the muzzle no less than a foot away from Elza's head. As Champ was about to finish the job though, he had a moment of realization. He knew the man in the hospital bed before him, and he knew him well. Elza had once been Champ's brother-in-law during Champ's first marriage. Champ then lowered his rifle and the two began a conversation. It was brief and cordial, and for a moment it seemed like Champ would spare Elza because of their past family history. But then Champ leveled the rifle once again and pulled the trigger. The gun jammed, so he tried again, only to have it misfire a second time. He then tried a third time with the same result, all while Elza begged and pleaded for his life. Champ would hear none of this though, and on the 4th try, the rifle finally fired and Elza went instantly right there in his bed. Like it was nothing, Champ then walked back out of the room and continued his rampage. He targeted everyone too, white soldiers, black soldiers, men who were crawling to try to get away, and others who were pleading. All met with the same end if Champ came across them. Outside the hospital, when he spotted a young white private badly wounded and dragging himself along the dirt, Champ shouted while standing over him, demanding to know why he'd fight alongside the blacks. Champ got no answer from the terrified boy, and tired of waiting for one, Champ then asked him where he wanted the bullet. Again, he received no reply from the wounded soldier, so Champ just finished him and moved on. The massacre that occurred that day only stopped when a separate Confederate unit, made up of largely Cherokee and mountain troops, arrived and intervened. Champ and his men then fled the area once the actual Confederate command was present. Unfortunately, at that point, it didn't matter much though, because their work was done anyway. This horrific incident would be some of the last violence Champ and his guerrilla group would perpetrate, but it's remembered as one of their most brutal and notorious. Unlike some of those who took up the Confederate cause during the Civil War, Samuel Champ Ferguson didn't start out as an extremist for any one ideology. He was more concerned with his own personal interests. Born in 1821 as the oldest of 10 children, Champ was raised in a stretch of southern Kentucky where the region's terrain shaped its people and communities were tight-knit and isolated. And there, they were quick to settle disputes without sending for any outside authority. If someone crossed you, the expectation wasn't that the law would sort it out. Instead, you handled things yourself, and Champ exemplified that way of life. By adulthood, he was tall and built solidly, and he was hard to ignore because he carried himself arrogantly with that knowledge. He didn't expect people to test him, and he acted like those who did would come to regret that decision. Then, to top it all off, Champ drank, gambled, and had a reputation for liking confrontation more than most people. And despite growing up in an area where most families farmed modest plots and owned no enslaved people, Champ did well enough for himself to buy land and livestock in an area. He also would eventually go against the norm of his home region and became a slave owner. So by local standards, he was quite comfortable and much better off than his family, which was full of poor farmers. More than money though, what truly defined Champ's outlook on life was how he viewed interpersonal relationships. There seems to have been no shades of gray in Champ's mind when it came to others. People were either with him or against him. That worldview wasn't necessarily unusual for the region, but Champ had a willingness to act on it that set him apart from others. And if there was one single moment that locked Champ onto the road he'd spend the rest of his life going down, it happened in the summer of 1858. By then, his temper and reputation for confrontation was already well established, but a dispute in August took things to a whole new level. That month, an argument broke out between Champ and the Evans family, specifically brothers Floyd and Alexander. The details of what set it off aren't exactly known, but what happened next is. The situation escalated hard and fast, ending with bloodshed on both sides. When it was over, one man was dead and another was barely alive. James Reed, a relative of the Evans brothers and a local constable, was killed in the dispute, and Floyd was stabbed multiple times and left lingering on the edge of death. Champ, who was the one who had done it all, soon found himself outnumbered and facing a group of very angry men who wanted immediate payback. Around those parts, a man responsible for 2 brutal stabbings didn't often walk away from a scene like that, but Champ didn't stick around long enough to see how it played out. He instead fought his way out of the region and fled, but it was a crime that would hang over his head anyway and influence his decisions from that point forward. When the Civil War arrived, the region around the border of Kentucky and Tennessee was not a place where everyone neatly picked one side and lived united. Loyalty was scattered and deeply personal. Counties could lean one way, while the very next county over could sympathize with the opposite side. One household might see itself on the side of the Union, while its relatives might swear allegiance to the Confederacy. In many cases, people actually didn't really care for either side. They just cared about keeping their land and surviving whatever fighting rolled in their direction. Clinton County, Kentucky, where Champ was from, largely favored the Union, but just a step over the border in parts of Tennessee, sympathy shifted toward the Confederacy. Champ's own family reflected that contradiction, as most of them supported the Union while Champ didn't. That's not to say his allegiance was the product of anything remotely bigger than himself, though. His decision to side with the Confederacy has been debated over the years among historians, but the consensus is that his motivations were likely simple and selfish. The incident that resulted in the death of James and the wounding of Floyd was something that Champ had still gone unpunished for, and the war presented the opportunity for all of that to be lost in the chaos. If the Confederates ultimately won the war, Champ believed there was no way he'd be brought up on charges. He was also a slave owner, so there was an economic motivation too. And further supporting the idea that this was selfish is that prior to the incident involving the Evans family, Champ had briefly aligned with the Union alongside 2 of his brothers. When the conflict became real though, and he saw an opportunity to have his past forgotten, he switched sides. The Confederacy looked like the safer bet for a man who wanted his court case tossed out. Interestingly, one of Champ's brothers, Jim Ferguson, enlisted on the Union side, and when Champ aligned with the Confederacy, the siblings actually swore that if they ever crossed paths in battle, neither would hesitate to kill the other. Jim, however, was killed in the war before that moment could arrive. But in any case, by late 1861, with the Civil War now raging, Champ realized he could no longer stay in his home county without running into trouble from neighbors who saw his Confederate sympathy as a threat. He then moved his wife and young daughter south to Tennessee and settled in a region aligned with the South. While the official armies were still getting their bearings in this new national war, Champ had already started his own army of sorts. He gathered a small group of men together and began operating outside the boundaries of any kind of formal command. This wasn't the only group of guerrilla fighters that involved themselves in the war, but Champ's group was fiercely loyal to him. And if you recall, Champ saw people completely in black and white as either friends or enemies, and with his allegiance sworn to the Confederacy, he and his guerrilla band terrorized those who supported the Union. In fact, if Champ believed someone was a Unionist in even the most casual sense, that was enough. All it took for him was a rumor of Union sympathy, and his first known killing of the war not only set the tone, it foreshadowed what would happen in Saltville years later. On November 1st, 1861, barely 7 months into the war, Champ and his group rode to the home of William Frog, a neighbor Champ had known for most of his life. When Champ arrived at the house, he learned that William was bedridden with a case of measles and was so weakened by it that he couldn't even get out of bed. Seeing Champ's familiar face though, William's wife invited him in and treated him like somebody stopping by for a normal visit. She even offered him a seat and an apple, but Champ declined both. Instead, he walked straight to the room where William was lying in bed and woke him up. And groggy from sleep and illness, William wasn't sure what was going on, but Champ got right to the point. He then asked William if he had stopped by a nearby Union recruitment camp. William was taken aback by the question and firmly denied the accusation. But incredibly, although Champ could see that he was sick and barely coherent and William was obviously in no condition to be traveling, none of that mattered. Champ had heard differently, and that was as good enough as a verdict. Champ didn't waste time debating William, and in one motion he lifted his pistol and fired twice in full view of his wife and child. As William's body lay there, Champ and his gang tossed the house looking for weapons. When they found none, they left as quickly and as casually as they had arrived. If anyone was unsure before that moment what kind of war Champ intended to fight, there was no question afterward, and he further solidified his stance a month later. Unlike William, Reuben Wood wasn't bedridden, but he was blinded by their past relationship. Reuben had known Champ since Champ was little, and they became good friends as he grew up. Reuben was outside doing chores when Champ arrived, flanked by 2 companions. Before Reuben even had a chance to greet the men, Champ launched into accusations that Reuben had visited a camp to enlist for the Union side. Reuben didn't deny visiting the recruitment camp like William had. Instead, he confirmed it and tried to appeal to the history the 2 men shared as friends. He reminded Champ that they had never crossed each other or had any kind of disagreement before. Sensing what was coming though, Reuben's wife and daughter began to panic and pleaded alongside him, trying to reason with Champ, who was now enraged by Reuben's confession. Champ then took a moment to compose himself and calmly admitted that Reuben had always treated him well, but then he shot him anyway. The first bullet didn't drop Reuben, so Champ fired again and missed. This gave Reuben a chance to stumble into his house for protection. He then grabbed a hatchet and braced himself behind a locked door. Champ then calmly walked around the house, entered through the unlocked back door, and came at Reuben again. The 2 men then struggled, and Reuben actually managed to fight Champ off, but the wound he had already taken was too severe, and he died the following day. After the deaths of William and Reuben, people in the area knew exactly what Champ was willing to do. Within a short time, he gathered a group of roughly 20 men who rode with him. And outside of Champ being the leader of the outfit, there was no formal command, and more importantly, no rules of war to follow. The men answered to Champ alone, and they were guided by his grudges and suspicions. Many of the men he would go on to target weren't soldiers, and most, like William and Reuben, were neighbors he had known for years. Among his body count were Union soldiers and members of the Home Guard, but most were simply farmers who may or may not have held anti-secessionist opinions. As you might imagine, stories of his brutality spread quickly, especially among those who stood against him. He killed prisoners of war, the elderly, the incapacitated, and those who had no chance of defending themselves. Stories emerged that he would sometimes decapitate his victims and roll their heads down a hillside. On occasions, when his own men showed hesitation, he saw this as complete disobedience. There was at least one moment when he reacted angrily to one of his fighters choosing not to shoot a young teenager who was trying to run away from one of their attacks. And even the side he supported found it difficult to support Champ's efforts. Confederate authorities arrested him at one point, accusing him of killing someone tied to their own government. Champ then spent weeks in custody and waited to face consequences, but the accusation didn't result in a conviction, largely because wartime justice was unpredictable and evidence of his involvement was scarce. So eventually he was released, ultimately freeing him up to participate in the horrific Saltville incident of 1864. As the war dragged on, the list of people he killed grew longer, and Champ became less discriminating in his choice of targets. On one particularly brutal day, he killed 5 people in separate encounters, ending his spree by shooting a teenager. And while Champ certainly saw a purpose to firearms, there were plenty of accounts that described a different method of killing. He apparently often used a Bowie knife, which was a much more up-close and personal method. This all culminated when the Confederate war effort collapsed in April of 1865 and the shooting was supposed to stop. For Champ, however, this didn't change much about how he was behaving. He kept doing what he had been doing for years, only without even the thin justification of supporting the Confederate cause. Finally, though, this caught up with him. Union leadership had no interest in debating his intentions or hearing about his personal grudges. By then, his name was too well known and attached to too many killings. Orders were issued that he was not to be paroled, negotiated with, or folded into the category of ordinary Confederate soldiers. He was to be arrested and charged, and the sooner the better. When Union troops came for him in late May of 1865, Champ surprisingly didn't fight or try to flee. He was taken peacefully into custody at his home and moved to Nashville to stand trial in front of a military court. The charges against him afterward were staggering in both number and scope. More than 50 murders were formally attributed to him, but the unofficial number is thought to be higher. Word was that Champ had killed in excess of 100 people during his Civil War guerrilla campaign. He also never tried very hard to dispute any of the numbers attributed to him, and in fact, he often talked like a man who kept track of the numbers. When the trial got underway, his defense argued that Champ was a legitimate commissioned officer for the Confederacy and thus fell under the same protections granted to sanctioned combatants. In other words, like an official soldier, he should have been immune from prosecution for any killing done during the war. However, dozens of witnesses then testified, and many of them described the killings they'd seen, survived, or discovered after the fact. These were first-hand statements from people who had watched neighbors, friends, and family members die in moments that were not combat-related. When Champ was given the chance to speak in his own defense, remorse was nowhere in his statements. He justified every act he committed as a necessary action, claiming that the men he killed would have done the same to him if they had the chance. He made it clear that he didn't view himself as having stepped outside the rules of war. When the witnesses were done testifying and the evidence was completely presented, the jury was sent to deliberate, and they returned a fast verdict. Champ was found guilty of committing the 53 murders he was charged with, and his sentence was death by hanging. On October 20th, 1865, just 10 days after the verdict was read in court, Champ's end took place in Nashville in full view of a public that followed his trial closely. Crowds gathered, as they often did at the time, to watch Champ walk to the gallows calmly enough that witnesses remembered it. Before the trapdoor was opened and the act was carried out, Champ loudly asked for God to have mercy on his soul. With those last words, the lever was pulled, but things did not go exactly as planned. It would take nearly 20 minutes before he'd be pronounced dead. Afterward, his body was released to his family, which granted Champ's last request to be buried in, quote, pure Confederate soil. His body was then taken back to White County, Tennessee, not far from the region where he'd spent the war committing all of his crimes. Almost as soon as Champ was dead, two competing versions of him began circulating. One was built from trial records, witness testimonies, the bodies of his victims, and his own statements. The other was created from resentment, nostalgia, selective memory, and a new cultural project taking root in the defeated South, which was reshaping the narrative. In some corners, Champ started to get reframed as a man pushed past the limits and who was willing to fight and die for his allegiances. Within a few years, stories appeared claiming Union soldiers had tormented his family, brutalized his home, and even murdered one of his children in front of him. These details may have been dramatic and memorable, but they were entirely false. One popular version went that his young son had been deliberately taken by a Union soldier for waving a Confederate flag. Other variations cast him as a hero who was initially reluctant to bear arms and had only turned to violence after being cornered by oppression. This too, however, falls apart under scrutiny. Long before a single regiment had moved through Kentucky or Tennessee, Champ already had a record of violence. This also works the opposite way too, though. Tales of rolling heads down hills may have been little more than Union-created propaganda, but at the same time, there's little doubt among historians that Champ was depraved enough to have done such a thing anyway. In any case, Champ was one of only 3 men brought up on charges and executed for war crimes perpetrated during the Civil War. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.